a few of the averages that might interest you and let you get an idea of what's been happening. These are 10-year averages. We have about 74,000 wildland fires per year. About 98% of those are suppressed at initial attack, at first response. So we're very good at our job, but the 1% that we don't catch become very large fires. We burn about 2.9 million hectares a year in wildland fires. That's the 10-year average. We do about 1 million hectares a year of prescribed fire, and of that, about 500,000 of that, the U.S. Forest Service does on the national forest lands. And just some significant statistics from last year to give you an idea. So last year, 67,000 plus wildfires, a slow year, almost 10,000 wildfires less than the average. Lightning caused 9,443 of those fires. They burned 2.7 million hectares, the lightning caused fires. The U.S. Forest Service had 7,098 of those fires and 1.08 million hectares of U.S. Forest Service land burned. 51 of those fires were over 16,000 hectares in size. The largest last year was the Long Draw Fire in Oregon. It burned 225,000 plus hectares. The costliest fire was the Chips Fire in California. It cost $53.3 million to suppress. So we've a lot of talk about global warming and climate change and how things have changed recently since maybe the 70s and 80s. And I think that this graph really represents a new trend that we're seeing. When I talk to my fellow incident commanders throughout the U.S., we all scratch our head and wonder what we're seeing. Every year seems worse than the last year. This is a graph of fires over 100,000 acres or over 40,000 plus hectares from 1970 on, and you can look and see that since about the mid-90s, the graph is just going upward and skyward, averages of 14, 15, 100,000 plus acre fires per year now. These are the mega fires, the very large fires. They burn for weeks or months at a time. Super hard to control. They're the fires that cost us the most money and the most concern. Two graphs here that are, I think, somewhat interesting and maybe start to tell the story a little bit about climate change also. If you look at the bottom graph, is the number of fires per year. Throughout the 1960s and up into the 80s, we had a lot of fires per year. Averaging probably close to 150,000 fires a year, 120,000 fires a year. It started to drop off in the 80s, and most of that, I think, had to do with some good prevention efforts, a difference in the way that burning permits were issued, especially for agriculture and burning like that. And that fire regime, a number of fires per year, has held fairly steady in that 70,000 range. But what you see in the upper graph is the number of acres burned per year. And what you see from when the time we started having less fires, our fires got bigger for the number of acres burned per year. Before, I think before about 1996, or even before 1960, we only had two years where we exceeded 6 million acres per year. Since 1996, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, looks like about 11 years since 96, where we've exceeded 6 million acres a year, and almost reaching 10 million acres a year in 2005. So is it climate change? If you ask many of my counterparts, they would tell you something's definitely different. And we're definitely having larger fires, more acres burned. I got this out of a newspaper in California, but I found it very interesting, the rising temperatures, the middle graph, that the average temperature in California has increased by about 1.5 degrees since the 1800s. And then the more important, I think, graph, the more severe fire graph, that the average annual acres burned since 2000 is almost twice the average annual acres burned from 1950 till 2000. So in 50 years, the average stayed fairly close. In the last 10 years, the average has doubled on the average acres burned, and that is just in one state. That's just California. Expectations, we get this from our scientists that work for the U.S. Forest Service and other agencies. Climate change is expected to alter both the temperature and precipitation regimes. We've heard that this morning from the speakers. I don't believe there's any disputing that. And with that change in temperature and that change in precipitation, we can expect more ignitions, higher spread, and more intense wildfires. A couple of things that we're fairly sure of. The temperatures will rise, but the models are somewhat uncertain on precipitation. We expect extremes in weather, and I think this is one of the most important parts about climate change. Extreme droughts, and we've seen that in the last decade in the United States. We've seen droughts that have lasted for years in some states. And extreme precipitation. So you've seen extreme droughts in Colorado. If you've watched the news lately, they've had major wildfires the last 2 years, and then they had major floods just a few months ago. Droughts are a major factor in our large megafires, our large long-term fires, without a doubt. And the droughts tend to extend our fire seasons, both on each end of the fire season. Some ecosystems, such as the grass shrub ecosystem, there might be an expectation of increased rainfall, but what that will probably do will increase the growth of those fuels. And the increased precipitation you could have less fires, but with the increased growth in fuels, when you have a fire, you could have a mega fire, one that would be very hard to control. In other ecosystems, the timber and forest, higher temperatures will certainly lead, and predictions there are usually less rainfall in the upper areas, the northern climes, less rainfall, and certainly more intense, larger type fires with much more intensity. We also expect vegetation changes as the climates change, and insect outbreaks were mentioned this morning, and I'll talk about those briefly here in a minute. Costs will continue to rise to suppress wildfires. Back in 1991, the U.S. Forest Service budget, our whole budget, 13% of it was spent on suppressing wildland fires. Today, 50% of our budget is spent on suppressing wildland fires. That means the money that used to go to timber, to wildlife, to recreation, and all the other management activities of the U.S. Forest Service now goes to fire. So all those other programs are shrinking. The fire program is growing, but at the expense of other programs. Longer fire seasons. There was a recent Harvard University study that predicted by 2050, fire seasons in the western U.S. will start 2 to 3 weeks earlier and end 2 weeks later. That's quite a few days of extra fire season. The area burned in August could increase by 65% in the Pacific Northwest, the Washington State, Oregon area. That's a tremendous increase in 1 month in August alone as the climate changes. It could double in the Great Plains and quadruple in the Rocky Mountain region. The probability of very large fires would increase by a factor of 2 to 3. So our mega fires or our really large fires of the 100,000 acre size, we could see twice as many or 3 times as many of those. The picture here is the Bugaboo Swept Farm fire. That fire burned in Georgia and Florida. It crossed the state line. It didn't care about which state it was in. It burned about 200,000 hectares. It was still smoking the following spring. So it burned throughout the winter, mainly in ground fuels, mainly in peat and muck. But the next spring, in April and May, they were still putting water on that fire that had started in July the previous year. And then the station fire, it started outside of its normal fire season. That was right outside of Los Angeles. It burned for 2 months. Longer fire seasons. Westerling did a really interesting paper, I think it was in 2006, comparing the 1970 through 86 era through the 86 and 03 fire seasons, and saw an increase by 78 days, mostly in the early fire season for when fires start. Some long-term satellite data that was studied by Schwartz consistently shows earlier spring and longer growing season. This is satellite data that shows green up of the area in the United States. So spring's occurring earlier and earlier every year, and the longer growing season's producing more growth on our fuels, and we're also having a longer fire season because of that. Strong correlation between snowpack in the western United States, the amount of snow they get in the mountains, it stays there during the winter and melts off during the summer. So when you have a late snow melt, this particular picture of the western U.S. right here, you can see the number and size of fires that happen with a late snow melt. It's a fairly benign season. But when you have an early snow melt, as the picture to my far left shows, numerous and large fires occur as the snow melts early. And again, if we're going to have earlier springs, we're going to have earlier snow melt, we're going to have increased growth in the vegetation, we're going to have longer and longer fire seasons and larger fires. Mountain pine beetle was mentioned earlier. So the insects that are out there, some of the scientists believe that these insects now have the opportunity to breed twice per year, where they might have only bred once per year before. They hatch out earlier. They have much more time to spread over much larger areas, so they kill many more trees than they used to. So the small outbreaks now become large epidemic type of outbreaks. In the 1990s, over 180,000 square kilometers of trees have been killed by pine beetle. And in British Columbia, somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 million hectares in just one of their states in Canada, killed by pine beetles. The impact on fire suppression, of course, there's more fuel available. As these trees die, they produce red, dead crowns. That can really help spread to crown fire, large, hard-to-control fires. The strategies that are used on fires like this have to be indirect. These are not the type of fuel types where you can get close to the fire and put in a fire line. You have to back off some distance. You have to look for natural fuel breaks, roads, areas where you can get your fire lines in and make a good stand before the fire gets there. So this will also lead to larger fires because of the indirect strategies that are necessary to deal with these heavy fuel loads. The other problem with these dead trees are snags. Snags are a dead tree, still standing. Almost every year in the United States, we lose one, if not more, firefighters to snag fatalities. These dead and dying trees that fall over without warning and hit our firefighters and kill them. So it's another big hazard. Climate change causes the beetle outbreaks or perhaps exasperates them, doesn't cause them. More dead trees, more fuel on the ground, higher firefighter fatalities from snags, perhaps, and certainly harder to suppress fires. Also, you could end up seeing some species composition changes, especially in areas where this bug kill has died and has been burnt hard to the ground. You can get hydrophobic soils from the burning that sheds water. The same species that were growing there may not grow back, or nothing may grow back for some time. Some major issues and concerns. Population increases. I think everybody here has mentioned that at some point in their presentation. But the population in the U.S. continues to move out into the wildlands, away from the urban areas, and that presents a problem for us as wildland fire managers. In 1940, less than 500,000 residents lived within a half a mile of a national forest. And we're talking about just national forests, not parks. There's 152 national forests, so back in the 40s, 500,000 people lived within half a mile. In 2000, 1.8 million people live within a half a mile of a national forest. So you can see the problem that we have with the population exploding out into the wildland and the problems that that's going to present for us. In many parts of the U.S., out in the wildland, there is no fire protection service. Some communities don't even have a volunteer fire department. They count on agencies like the U.S. Forest Service or others to come save their homes. You know, our primary mission has changed somewhat from suppressing the fire to saving homes. And in that process, of saving homes and evacuating people, fires get larger because we're not suppressing them as actively as we could. More of our resources are spent trying to evacuate people and save their homes. What we really need is some risk sharing by those communities. And in that I mean that many of these homeowners do nothing to protect their houses. I was in Northern California a few months ago. I rode through an area that I had been on a fire in 1977, and nothing has changed. That particular part of Northern California experiences large wildland fires every year, yet the people that live there refuse to clean up around their homes. Many of them have the brush and the trees growing right over top their roof. So without risk sharing by them, it brings to question people like me, why do we want to risk our lives and our firefighters' lives to save their homes? Yet politically, that seems to be what we're motivated to do. So in order to solve this problem of the population explosion that's going out into the wildland, we need these folks to understand where they live and to understand that they have to accept part of the risk also. These are three really neat pictures. The one on the far left, this is a ponderosa pine stand in California, I believe. No, in the Bitterroot National Forest, in Montana. So in the early 1900s, you see what this forest looked like. It was a wide open forest, grassy understory. The trees were well spaced apart. By the mid-1900s, you can see the brush starting to grow in. Some different species of trees, some spruce and fir, are starting to invade that longleaf or that ponderosa pine stand. And then by the late 1900s and the 1990s, that is the same area, the same picture. You can't even see the ponderosa pine. All you can see is this huge mix of fir and other trees tightly packed, just waiting for their opportunity to burn. So I mentioned we've been very good at initial attack in the U.S. We are successful 98% of the time. But that also has led to this problem right here. As we suppress every fire, we fail to use opportunities to let some fires grow, where we could do some managed fire and control the fuel load. Less prescribed fire and resource benefit fires is kind of where we're headed. So we're no longer, although we do a lot of prescribed fire, the trend seems to be going down. We have a hard time, I think, convincing the public that these are good things. Depends on which part of the country you're in. Some folks will just not tolerate smoke in their valleys, while others don't care if you burn right up to their backyards. The lack of public understanding and acceptance of prescribed fire, or of the fact of letting fires grow where possible. We haven't communicated very well as agencies or as the government that some of these fires are beneficial, that they need to be expanded. And then one of the other things that's happened, especially since the late 80s, is logging. We take fewer and fewer trees off national forest lands and even off private lands, so the lack of logging increases that biomass, increases that fuel bed out there, decreases the amount of roads we have, and decreases the amount of opportunities we have to have places to stop fires. So we're building a great biomass in the United States. The question, I guess, becomes, do we want this? This was a picture in Washington State of a fire that I managed. That is dead and dying lodgepole pine, killed by mountain pine beetle. And you can see the tremendous fuel load of dead and dying on the ground, while other trees are still dying. Or do we want this after a beautiful prescribed fire in Florida, under burning longleaf pine? And obviously we want this, but how do we convince the public that we need more of this and less of this? Some of the strategies that have been developed to try to deal with this is allow fire to play its natural role in the ecosystem when and where possible. Now again, we don't always have public support for this, so we have fires that we can now suppress part of the fire and allow the other part of the fire to sort of grow, to play its natural role. And incident management teams are encouraged to do this where possible. Many places the public don't support it, so it makes for a difficult decision process for not only the incident management team, but the agency administrators that they work for. In 2006, I managed a fire in Idaho that had the perfect opportunity to let it grow. It was surrounded by fire scars from multiple years. The agency administrator was supportive of it. There were basically no communities involved, 2 small communities of maybe 500 homes total. And our task was to grow this fire, not hurt our firefighters, and protect those 2 communities. When we took the fire over, it was 50,000 acres in size. 3 weeks later, it was 300,000 acres in size. We saved both communities, lost no homes, and it was a tremendous success. But in most places, when you tell people that you grew a fire from 50,000 acres to 300,000 acres, they would wonder if that's successful or not. I can guarantee that those 2 communities won't have to worry about wildfire like they did every year. They're probably safe for the next 20 years now before they have another fire problem. We need to use fire for resource benefit. With proper planning, fires can be monitored and not even suppressed at all. So I think Gabriel talked a little bit about the fires in Yellowstone. What they didn't know then was how the summer was going to turn out, but they had a strategy that they thought was sound, and that was early in the season, let the fires grow naturally, the rains will come and they'll go out, and we will have successfully managed some fires, and for ecosystem benefit, we'll have done what Mother Nature required for us to do. It's just that in 1998 it was a terrible year and a drought year, and it just didn't play out that way. But we still have the opportunity to do that in places. We don't take that opportunity near enough, in my opinion, but it does happen occasionally. We need to continue and increase prescribed fire projects and fuel reduction efforts. I don't think we can burn our way out of this problem. One time ago, 15 years ago, I thought prescribed fire was the answer. I thought that if we did enough prescribed burning, we could probably solve this problem of wildfire. I don't believe that's possible anymore. Climate change probably has something to do with that too. It makes prescribed burning harder these days also. And we do some other fuel reduction type work like a thinning of trees, taking away the understory. Most of this is done near the urban interface, near homes and communities to, if fire should approach them, there's an opportunity to try to stop the fire in that lesser fuel type. We can employ some indirect strategies and some point protection strategies to keep firefighters safe and increase the chances of success. So if climate change continues and we're going to have larger fires, we're going to have more intense fires, we've got to look at ways to fight these fires. And just going to the next ridge and trying to put a line in and stop it is not the answer. Because more often than not, we go to the next ridge, we put a line in, the fire spots that ridge. We go to the next ridge, and we go to the next ridge. We don't need to go to the next ridge. We need to go to the best ridge. And if the best ridge is 5 miles away or 10 kilometers away, that's the ridge we need to go to stop the fire. We can use point protection strategies. The fire I just talked about that I managed in Idaho. That was our strategy. Our strategy was to protect the infrastructure, the 2 small towns, and the few scattered ranches, and to do that effectively and to let the fire grow otherwise. So we concentrated our efforts there, and we built exactly on a 300,000 acre fire, 1/4 mile of fire line. That's all. These fires eventually burned into other old fire scars late in the fall and went out. The snows came and they went out. When you can do that, that's the way to go. And then again, we have a few other things that we've been looking at, and one is we're working on a cohesive strategy that involves all the different agencies that have wildland responsibility, and getting them all to come together and redeem their responsibilities. So local fire departments, cities, municipalities, the Forest Service, the federal firefighters, all in a more strategic method working together to try to control these fires. The other thing that we can do is develop fire-wise communities. These are communities that take it upon themselves to do fuel reduction projects, to keep their homes safe, to do those sort of things so that they take responsibility for themselves, and it also makes our job as wildland firefighters easier to suppress fires as it comes toward these communities. The risk-sharing dialogue I talked about briefly already, but we've got to have that risk-sharing dialogue with cities, communities, private individuals. They have to understand that when they build in the wildland, they assume a risk, and that they have to do something to mitigate that risk themselves. They have to take care of their land and themselves. Then one thing that we're very poor at, and that's develop and enforce laws and regulations for fire-safe properties. Every state is somewhat independent in the United States. In some places like Southern California, they do have some laws on building codes, how much clearing they have to have around their house, and they actually inspect and enforce those laws. Most states have nothing of the sort at all. You can build your house out of whatever you want, and you can have your brush and your trees as close as you like to your house. And those are the ones that are very hard to defend. Insurance companies, in my point of view, don't seem to care too much to enforce any of this. So they're happy to pay you for your house after it burns and reinsure you again and take your money. And then the last thing, we do need to continue research into climate change and its effects in wildland fire. There is a climate change resource center lab at the Rocky Mountain Research Lab that is doing that. And there's other researchers, Forest Service researchers nationwide that are working on these issues. The last thing I want to leave you with is my greatest concern as a fire manager, as an incident commander. Do more fires mean more fatalities? Because this is the thing that bothers me. These are the fatalities by year, dating back to 1935 and going to 2011. And you can see a dramatic increase in the number of fatalities that we have every year, starting in the late 80s through this year. Most of you are familiar with the Yarnell Hill fire from this year that killed 19. I believe so far this year in the U.S., 32 wildland firefighters have been killed. So it's going to be a near record year. And this is my biggest concern, is what will climate change mean to the wildland firefighter? Merci beaucoup. Thank you.